Right now, as you are listening to this, there is an estimated $7.6 trillion legally
Wow.
hidden on islands and in tax havens all across the world.
Yeah, which is an absolutely staggering figure when you really think about it.
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, that is money that should be fixing your local roads, funding your hospitals, maybe subsidizing your energy grid, but it's practically invisible.
Completely invisible. And today we are going to look at the exact mechanics of how that money vanished and why your rent went up because of it.
Exactly. Because this gets to the absolute core of a pervasive feeling so many people have right now.
Mm.
You internalize this massive architectural shift in the global economy and, well, you treat it as a personal failing.
Or you think, I must be doing something wrong. I need to budget better. I need a side hustle.
Yes. You talk to almost anyone, especially younger people, and you hear the exact same story. You do everything right, you
Yeah.
study hard.
You get the degree.
You land the quote-unquote good job with a salary that your parents would have been absolutely thrilled about. But then you look at your bank account at the end of the month, and you feel like you're just running on a treadmill.
Yeah, you're sweating, you're exhausted, but you aren't actually moving forward. You're just working to survive the month.
And that is because the treadmill itself has been tilted on a massive incline. So our source material today is this incredibly detailed document by an author named MGR titled Capitalism Summary for Gen Z.
And it really shatters the illusion that this is your fault. The mission of this deep dive isn't to just sit around and complain about the economy, though.
No, definitely not. The goal here is to unpack exactly why the economic rules feel rigged against you. We are looking under the hood.
Right. We are moving past the usual complaints to understand the actual literal mechanics of the board game we are all currently playing.
And that board game has fundamentally changed. The research provides this very stark, very analytical look at a massive historical shift over the last century.
Yes, we have essentially moved from an economy of ownership to an economy of extraction. Throughout this deep dive, we're going to connect the dots between global finance, historical shifts, and, well, your shrinking bank balance.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the very first thing the data does is draw a massive, thick line between two words we usually treat as the exact same thing: income and wealth.
This is so crucial. The document points out that this is the absolute fundamental difference you have to understand if you want to know why the system feels rigged.
So mechanically speaking, what is the difference here? Because I think most people use them interchangeably.
It basically comes down to the difference between trading your time and owning an asset. So income, or the pay packet, is the money you get for your labor. It's what you earn from your job.
You work 40 hours, you get paid for 40 hours.
Precisely. Wealth, on the other hand, is about what you own, not what you earn. Wealth consists of assets. These are things that generate money while you sleep, or they just go up in value over time independently of your physical labor.
All right, so we were talking about property, land, maybe factories, stocks.
Yes, all of that. And crucially, even debt.
Debt. Wait, how is debt wealth?
If someone owes you money and they are paying you interest on that money, that debt is a performing asset to you. It makes you richer without you lifting a finger.
Oh, wow. Okay, that makes sense.
And the fundamental thesis of MGR's summary is that in today's economy, work, meaning trading your labor for income, is becoming structurally meaningless.
Because it no longer leads to asset ownership.
Exactly. It doesn't lead to long-term security. You trade your time for a salary, and that salary is immediately eaten up by the baseline costs of living.
Which brings us to this concept of the subscription trap. The research argues that this generation is the first to experience a totally pervasive subscription culture.
And it is so much bigger than just paying 15 quid a month for Netflix or Spotify.
Way bigger. It's housing, because you don't own a home. You essentially subscribe to a landlord via rent.
It's your software, your phone apps, even hardware in cars now. You pay a monthly fee to use them, but you never actually own them.
Right. It is like a gym membership you can never, ever cancel, where the equipment keeps getting heavier, but the fee keeps going up.
That's a great way to put it. And what's fascinating here is how the economist Gary Stevenson describes this exact phenomenon. He calls it a wealth trap. And the document actually uses the term modern feudalism.
Feudalism, like actual kings and peasants.
Mechanically, yes. Think about it. In a feudal system, the lords owned the land and the peasants worked it.
And the peasants had to pay a massive portion of their crop yield to the lord just for the right to exist on that land.
Exactly. Today, a small elite owns nearly everything. The digital infrastructure, the housing, the debt. While the rest of us are effectively renters, we are locked into this cycle with almost no chance of owning our own pieces of the board.
Okay, but I have to stop you there because honestly, let's play devil's advocate for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
I mean, I don't want to own a home if it means I have to fix a broken boiler that costs £2,000. And I actually like paying a small monthly fee for Spotify instead of buying a massive library of CDs.
It is convenient.
Right. We are a mobile generation. We want to travel. We don't want to be tied down to a 30-year mortgage. So mathematically, isn't the subscription economy just a natural evolution of convenience? Isn't it exactly what the consumer wants?
Well, marketing certainly leans heavily into that idea of freedom and convenience. You hear that phrase, own nothing and be happy, thrown around as this utopian ideal.
Yeah, you see it everywhere.
But the research makes a very clear mechanical distinction between a shared wealth economy and an unequal wealth economy. In a shared wealth economy, that convenience is a choice, not a mandate.
Because wealth is broadly distributed.
Right. People own the homes they live in, workers have pensions, citizens collectively own large parts of the country's productive capacity, and the result is that the income from those assets, the rent, the dividends, actually circulates.
It's shared. It's a circle. The money moves from a business to a worker and then to another local business.
Exactly. It sustains demand across the board. But in the unequal wealth economy we have today, wealth is highly concentrated in the hands of a small elite, typically the top 1%.
So you don't own your home. You don't hold significant shares.
And so your only income comes from wages. And where do those wages go? They flow upward.
The rent goes to corporate landlords.
The interest payments on your credit cards go to banks. This is not a cycle of prosperity, as the analysis describes it. It is a funnel. And it funnels everything up to the top, permanently removing it from your community.
That makes a lot of sense. And MGR uses an analogy that I think is absolutely brilliant for understanding this funnel. It compares the economy to a game of Monopoly.
A very apt comparison.
Yeah. So I want you to imagine starting a game of Monopoly with your grandparents. Let's call this the early game. The board is completely empty. Almost every single square you land on is available to buy.
And every time you pass go, which represents getting your salary, you use that money to buy more of the board.
Exactly. You are building wealth. It's a very straightforward mechanic.
The salary allows for asset acquisition.
Right. But now, imagine the late game. This is Gen Z entering the economy today. You join that exact same Monopoly game, but it has already been going on for 4 hours.
So the board is full.
Every single square on the board already has a hotel on it. So no matter what you roll, no matter where you land, you have to pay massive rent to the players who started the game decades before you.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the implication of that analogy is devastating for the value of labor. It means that pass and go is utterly meaningless.
Yes. You can get a great job, you can get a promotion and a bonus, but that salary is instantly eaten by the rent you owe just for standing on the board.
The research points out that the rich are currently earning over £1 million a week in passive income simply because they own the board.
While you are struggling to save enough from your salary to buy a single greenhouse,
It really puts it into perspective.
which is incredibly depressing, but also weirdly validating. You know, it proves that it isn't just you buying too many coffees. The board is already bought.
It is a structural reality.
But to really understand why the late game sucks so much, we have to look back. Because capitalism hasn't always been this closed loop. We have to look at when the system actually worked for the average person. The data calls this the golden era.
Yes. From roughly 1870 to 1970 in the West, particularly in the UK, the analysis stresses that capitalism hasn't always been this wealth trap. During this specific century, there was a unique window of shared wealth.
So the economy didn't just grow for the people at the top, it grew for everyone.
Correct.
So what did that actually look like on the ground? Because shared wealth sounds like a bit of a political buzzword. What was the mechanism in, say, 1950s Britain?
Practically speaking, the mechanism was widespread small-scale ownership. In 1950s Britain, a regular working-class person could reasonably expect to own the physical home they lived in. They had access to free education, meaning they started without a mountain of debt. They had the expectation of a job for life that came with a guaranteed, defined benefit pension.
And this middle class wasn't just made up of employees working for massive global corporations, right? It was heavily built on local ownership.
Yes, the corner shop model. The document talks about this a lot. The high street used to be defined by family-owned small businesses. Those owners had a direct stake in their community.
So the wealth generated in the town actually stayed in the town.
Correct. And contrast that with the shift to big retail today. Those small community assets have been largely cannibalized by giants like Amazon or massive supermarket chains.
The text describes these modern giants not as community assets, but as corporate extraction points,
That is such a vivid phrase, isn't it? Corporate extraction points.
because that is exactly how they function mechanically. When you bought groceries at the local corner shop in 1950, that shop owner used the profit to pay a local plumber, who bought a pint at the local pub. The money bounced around the community.
But today, you buy from a massive online retailer, and that money is immediately extracted from your local area. It is funneled upward to shareholders who likely don't even live in your country.
And the analysis points out that this exact same squeeze is happening with housing right now.
Oh, absolutely.
Historically, being a small landlord, maybe owning one or two extra properties, was a standard path for middle-class families to build a portfolio and secure their retirement.
Right. It's very common.
But today, the data argues that new legislation and tax structures actually penalize the small landlord. It effectively forces them to sell their properties to massive corporations and institutional investors.
Investors who have the legal teams and financial loopholes to completely bypass the rules. It's the systematic elimination of the small player from the board.
So my question is, what changed? Because it feels a bit conspiratorial to just say, quote unquote, the system is doing this. Was this just the natural, inevitable evolution of a globalized economy, or was this a deliberate political shift?
MGR leans heavily into the idea that this was a deliberate political pivot. The document cites the analysis of a thinker named Shahid Bulsin. And to be exceptionally clear here, we are presenting this strictly as an analysis of the mechanics of power and money.
Right, regardless of where anyone sits on the political spectrum. We aren't endorsing candidates here. We are just looking at how the machine operates. Let's just follow the money.
Exactly. So Bolson argues that in the golden era, politicians generally represented national principles or the interests of the private citizen. There was a sense of civic duty to the nation's state.
Okay.
But Bolson argues that today we have witnessed a corporate capture of politics. Leaders no longer answer to the individual voter. They answer to what he calls a national capital and big tech.
And national capital, meaning capital that doesn't belong to any nation. It has no loyalty to Britain or the U.S. or anywhere. It's just a floating cloud of wealth.
Precisely. The source specifically uses the modern example of Elon Musk's financial backing of Donald Trump to illustrate this dynamic. And again, removing the specific politics from it, the structural argument being made is that when billionaires and tech giants fund the path to leadership, the resulting policies naturally and inevitably favor the 1% and the massive corporate players.
I mean, it's just return on investment for the billionaires. If a national capital funds the campaign, a national capital gets the favorable tax laws. The politicians legislate in favor of the people who bought their ticket to the dance rather than the small business owner.
That is the mechanical outcome, yes.
Well, let's look at the actual engine of that golden era. Because it wasn't just good politicians. There was a mathematical reality that made it work for those 100 years.
Yes, it worked because the economy was fundamentally productive rather than extractive. The core engine of this era was the wage productivity link.
Wait, break that link down for us. How did it function?
For 100 years, from roughly 1870 to 1970, as workers became more productive, as they utilized new technology to build more cars, generate more value, lay more bricks, their wages rose at the exact same rate.
So the line of productivity and the line of compensation moved upward together on the graph,
Exactly.
which is what allowed for the one-income dream. Because your wage actually reflected the real value you produced, a single salary was enough to buy a house, support a family, and still have savings.
Wealth circulated. It was a cycle of building new things, factories, homes, infrastructure, rather than just buying up existing things to rent them out at a higher price.
And because people had a physical stake in the system, because they owned their homes and had pensions, they were invested in the stability of the society. Work led directly to long-term security.
But as the data notes, around 1970, that ladder was violently pulled up.
And this is where the mystery really starts to unravel. The pivot. The great deception. How do we go from one single income buying a house and supporting a family to two full-time incomes barely being able to afford rent on a one-bedroom flat?
It is a drastic shift.
The document shows that the trap was set in the 1970s.
It started with a fundamental alteration to the very nature of money itself. The research points specifically to 1971 and what is known as the Nixon shock.
Okay, I have heard of the gold standard, and I know Nixon ended it,
Yeah.
but explain how a policy from 1971 actually impacts the listener's grocery bill today. Why does going off the gold standard matter to my paycheck?
Well, before 1971, the US dollar was backed by physical gold. The government couldn't just print infinite amounts of money whenever they wanted to fund a war or a deficit. The physical gold had to exist in a vault to back up the paper.
So it restricted the supply of money.
Exactly. But in 1971, President Nixon decoupled the dollar from gold, creating what we call fiat currency. Fiat money is backed by nothing but the government's promise.
So they could just type some zeros into a computer and print it out of thin air?
They can. And the mechanical why it matters for you, the listener, is dilution. Think of it like a pizza.
Okay, I like pizza.
If you have a pizza cut into 8 slices and your salary represents 1 slice, you have a solid meal. If the government suddenly prints trillions of new dollars, they're essentially slicing that same pizza into 80 pieces.
Oh, wow.
You still have 1 slice, but it's now incredibly thin. If you have a salary of, say, 50,000 pounds, and the government dilutes the money supply to fund its own deficits, the actual purchasing power of your 50,000 pounds plummets.
You're doing the exact same amount of work, but your money buys less.
Exactly.
Wait, but if we went off the gold standard in 71 and the money was suddenly backed by nothing, why didn't the US dollar just instantly become worthless paper? How did they keep it valuable if they were printing so much of it?
Because of a masterstroke of geopolitical engineering. This is where we see the creation of the petrodollar. The document details a massive geopolitical marriage of convenience.
Okay, what happened?
The U.S. went to the Gulf states, primarily Saudi Arabia. The U.S. offered high-end military protection, defense, and weapons. In exchange, the Gulf states agreed to sell their oil exclusively in U.S. dollars.
And because every single country on Earth, Japan, Germany, the UK needs oil to run their economy.
They are forced to hold U.S. dollars. If Japan wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, they can't pay in yen. They have to convert their yen into U.S. dollars first.
That is wild.
It creates an artificial, massive, infinite global demand for the paper the U.S. government is printing.
It gave the United States the ultimate leverage. They could run massive trade deficits, meaning they could buy real, physical goods like cars and electronics from the rest of the world simply by printing the paper that the rest of the world was forced to use to buy their energy.
Precisely. But domestically, this dilution had a terrible cost. Right around the mid-70s, you get this massive mathematical problem. Productivity kept rising, people were working harder and producing more goods, but wages suddenly flatlined.
The wage productivity link broke.
Because the money they were being paid with was losing value.
But wait, if regular wages flatlined and families couldn't afford basics, the system couldn't let consumer spending die, right? If nobody buys anything, the economy crashes.
Yeah.
So how did the system keep people buying houses and cars if they weren't paying them enough?
They introduced a painkiller, and that painkiller was the mass market credit card.
The original buy now, pay later.
Exactly. Instead of paying workers what they were actually worth, based on their productivity, the financial system offered to lend them the money they needed to maintain their middle-class lifestyle.
It was the credit illusion.
Yes, it made people feel like they were still getting richer when in reality they were just piling on high-interest debt to buy things they previously could have afforded with cash on a single salary.
And this ties into what the research calls the two-income trap. And this is fascinating because the text frames women entering the workforce in the 70s in a very specific economic light.
Right.
Obviously, it was a massive, necessary social and civil rights win. But the document points out it was also a desperate economic necessity.
It was structurally required to keep the system afloat. The purchasing power of a single salary plummeted so drastically that it now took 2 people working full-time just to afford the exact same lifestyle that one person could afford in 1955.
That's just bleak.
And the statistics on debt from the source are staggering. In the 1970s, the average household debt-to-income ratio was around 40%. Today, it has jumped to nearly 100%.
So we didn't get richer, we just became incredibly efficient at borrowing against our own futures.
Exactly.
And while the middle class is drowning in credit card debt just to buy groceries, what is happening at the top of the board? The document calls this the offshore exit, or quote-unquote picking your pockets.
And it brings in that heavy data we mentioned at the start from researchers Nicholas Shaxson and Gabriel Zucman.
Let's go back to that $7.6 trillion figure.
The figures here are almost difficult to comprehend. Based on leaks like the Panama and Pandora papers, Gabriel Zucman estimates that at least $7.6 trillion is hidden in offshore tax havens.
Which is roughly 1 out of every $10 of the world's financial wealth, completely removed from the system.
Yes, it is a fundamental breach of the social contract.
Wait, explain the mechanics of that. Because sometimes people hear tax haven and they just think of a sunny island with some bankers in linen suits. Why does some billionaire putting his money in the Cayman Islands actually affect my life here in a rainy city in the UK?
Well, think of money like water in a pipe. That water is meant to flow through a society to keep the crops alive, to fund roads, schools, hospitals, and infrastructure.
Okay, tracking.
If 1 in 10 gallons of water is siphoned off and hidden in an invisible offshore tank, that leaves the remaining 9 gallons to fund 100% of the world's infrastructure.
Ah, I see.
When the elite opt out of paying into the system still needs the same amount of money to function. Therefore, regular citizens are forced to pay the difference to make up for the shortfall.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because MGR calls this the ignorance tax. It connects this hidden wealth directly to the listener's daily life.
Yes, it touches everything.
It is the reason your local council taxes go up every year. It's the reason the roads are full of potholes. It's the reason the NHS is constantly squeezed and you can't get a doctor's appointment.
Exactly.
The politicians stand at podiums and claim there is a lack of funds, but the data is explicitly saying the money exists. It hasn't vanished. It is just sitting in a trust in Panama.
You are heavily subsidizing a society that the wealthy get to use for free. And the document brings up the famous Warren Buffett paradox to illustrate the absurdity of the current tax code.
Oh, I've always wondered about this. Warren Buffett famously noted that he pays a lower effective tax rate than his own secretary. How is that mechanically possible? Income tax is income tax. Does he just have a better accountant?
It's not just about accountants, it's about the nature of how the wealthy interact with money. Buffett pays a lower rate because he doesn't have an income in the traditional sense.
Wait, what do you mean?
When you or his secretary need money, you earn a wage. And the government takes 20, 30, 40% right off the top before you even see the cash.
Right. It's taxed at the source.
But a billionaire's wealth is tied up in assets, stocks, companies, real estate. If they need $10 million to buy a yacht or fund their lifestyle, they don't sell the stock and pay capital gains tax.
So what do?
Instead, they go to a bank and take out a loan, using their massive stock portfolio as collateral.
Oh, and debt isn't taxed.
Precisely. You don't pay income tax on a loan. It's a strategy often called buy, borrow, die. They buy assets, borrow against them at incredibly low interest rates to live tax-free, and hold them until they die.
So the system mechanically penalizes the person trading your labor for a wage and heavily rewards the person sitting on an appreciating asset.
Yes, that is exactly how the board is set up.
Okay, so if the 70s set the trap by decoupling money from gold, crushing wages, introducing credit, and allowing the ultra-rich to take their wealth offshore, what are they doing with the money they actually keep on shore?
That is the next piece of the puzzle.
The text argues that the last 20 years locked the door. We move from how money is hidden to how the money left behind is literally weaponized against us.
This is where we examine the asset funnel and the absolute failure of traditional economics to fix the problem. We talked about how money should circulate like water in a healthy economy.
Right, bouncing around the community.
But today, the analysis argues it's a one-way street because of the passive income machine.
And this relies on a concept called the consumption ceiling. I love this idea because it completely dismantles the myth of trickle-down economics. Break this down for us.
The logic is elegantly simple. A billionaire has a vast amount of wealth, but there are physical limits to human existence. They cannot physically eat 10,000 times more food than you.
They aren't going to buy 10,000 pairs of jeans or get 10,000 haircuts.
Exactly. There is a hard ceiling to how much they can consume in the real, everyday economy.
So all that excess cash doesn't trickle down into local shops.
It doesn't. They don't spend it in a way that creates jobs. So what do they do with the excess? They reinvest it in existing assets.
Because regular wages are too low, there isn't enough consumer demand to justify building new factories or new businesses.
So the wealthy just buy up what already exists.
Housing, land, stocks.
Yes. This floods the asset market with quote-unquote rich person money.
Yeah.
And this is the direct mechanical cause of the massive spike in property prices over the last 20 years.
Wow.
It's not that a 3-bedroom terrace house is inherently worth 10 times what it was in 1995. It's that a tsunami of elite, hoarded wealth is competing to buy it as an investment vehicle, skyrocketing the prices while your wages remain utterly stagnant.
But this is what drives me crazy. We have thousands of brilliant economists at the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve. We have central banks. Don't they have a control panel?
You would think so.
Right. Don't they have levers they can pull to fix this? What about interest rates and taxes? Can't they just adjust the dials to cool down the housing market?
This raises a vital question, and it's one the document addresses by heavily citing the economist Gary Stevenson. Stevenson argues that the central banker's tools are fundamentally broken because they are based on a false, outdated assumption. They assume everyone is playing the same game.
Right. They assume everyone reacts to interest rates the exact same way.
Let's look at the mechanics of interest rates. After the 2008 crash, economists lowered interest rates to basically zero for over a decade. The theory was that cheap borrowing would encourage regular people to spend, start businesses, and boost the economy.
But what actually happened? Let me guess. The rich got to the bank first.
Exactly. It made it incredibly cheap for the super rich and massive corporations to borrow millions of pounds at almost 0% interest. And what did they do with that free money?
They didn't build factories?
No, they used it to outbid you on a house.
Oh, wow. So cheap debt just became a weapon for the rich to buy up all the remaining assets on the monopoly board.
Yes. And conversely, look at what happens when they raise interest rates to cool down inflation, like we've seen recently. Central banks raise rates, which makes your mortgage incredibly expensive.
Yeah, people are really feeling that right now.
But it also acts as a massive transfer of government money to the wealthy who own government debt.
Wait, how does that work?
The government has to pay much higher interest to the bondholders. And who owns the bonds? The rich. So whether rates are low or high, the mechanics currently favor the asset owner.
That is just rigged.
You cannot fix wealth inequality by simply tweaking income tax or interest rates, because the truly wealthy do not live on income. Mainstream economics is trying to fix a hardware problem with a software patch.
And we are living through the symptoms of this broken control panel every day. The research calls these the symptoms of the 2008 glitch.
It's a very accurate term.
Since the financial crash, we've had a permanent cost of living crisis, where essentials like food and heating are unaffordable, but the luxury market for yachts and supercars is booming. We have massive asset bubbles, house prices entirely disconnected from local wages.
And a complete collapse in national productivity.
I mean, think about it mechanically. Why would a smart investor take the massive risk to build a new tech startup or a manufacturing plant when it is infinitely easier, safer, and more profitable to just buy up a block of existing houses and rent them out to Gen Z?
It heavily incentivizes extraction over creation, and this leads us straight into what the analysis defines as techno-feudalism. It is the grim realization of that own nothing and be happy marketing slogan we discussed earlier.
Which is really a rent-default lifestyle. Instead of your work leading to homeownership, your work leads to paying a feudal lord, a corporate landlord, a tech giant, for the revocable right to occupy a space or use a tool.
The text calls these life taxes.
You are taxed by corporations just to exist. And the macro result of this is that it kills disposable income. It stifles any real economic growth because if 60% of your income goes to rent and 20% goes to subscriptions, you have no money left to spend at the local corner shop.
Exactly. To make this incredibly concrete, the document zooms in on a specific case study. It looks closely at the United Kingdom's trajectory of privatization over the last 40 years.
It's a perfect tragic example of a nation voluntarily stripping its own physical assets and handing them over to the extraction economy.
The Great National Asset Strip.
This really starts with the Thatcher pivot in the 1980s, right?
Yeah.
The strategic political choice to abandon the UK's manufacturing base, closing the mines, the steel works, and bet everything on the service sector and the City of London's financial power.
Yes. The political spin at the time was that privatizing national utilities, energy grids, water companies, the rail network would create efficiency through the magic of the free market.
It was supposed to provide better value and lower prices for the customer through competition, which, spoiler alert, looking at the fact that it costs over £100 to take a train to Manchester, did not happen.
The mechanical reality, as the data points out, is that these essential services became extractive monopolies. Think about it. You can't choose a different set of pipes to bring water to your house.
Because they are natural monopolies, they don't actually have to compete for your business.
So instead of investing profits back into fixing the leaky pipes or upgrading the aging rail infrastructure, these massive private companies focus purely on short-term shareholder dividends.
They just extract the rent. And by shifting away from manufacturing, we didn't just lose the physical factories. The analysis highlights that we lost the muscle memory. We lost the skills and the control of production that actually made the UK a global power in the first place.
To truly understand the magnitude of this error, the text provides a brilliant comparative anecdote, a tale of two countries, the UK versus Norway.
Oh, this is the ultimate heartbreaking comparison because both the UK and Norway found massive reserves of North Sea oil at exactly the same time in the 1970s. They both hit the geographic lottery, but they took completely different paths.
The UK chose the path of immediate privatization. They sold off the drilling rights to private companies and used the immediate influx of tax revenue to fund short-term tax cuts and smooth over the painful transition into a service economy.
They effectively spent their inheritance on a brief, flashy holiday.
And what did Norway do? Norway treated the oil as a permanent national asset. They didn't sell it off, they maintained state control.
And most importantly, they channeled the revenue into a sovereign wealth fund. They invested the profits globally. Today, that fund is worth over $1.6 trillion.
1.6 trillion. They own shares in almost every major company on Earth.
Yes. And the practical mechanical result for the Norwegian citizen is profound. Norway has built a massive financial shield against the global cost of living.
Because the state has massive investment income, they can afford excellent public services.
Meanwhile, the UK, having sold its rights to its own resources decades ago, is now in a position where it has to rent its own energy back from private, often foreign-owned companies at a massive premium.
It's deeply frustrating. And this decision completely splintered the geography of the UK. London became this glowing, hyper-wealthy, global asset hub for finance and banking.
But the North and the Midlands,
Yeah.
places like Newcastle with its shipbuilding or Sheffield with its steel, they were completely hollowed out.
And that forces a massive youth migration. Young people have to leave their hometowns and move to London just to find work, which means they're transferring the value of their labor straight into the pockets of urban landlords, while their home regions just decay.
And this naturally leads to a question of reversal. If outsourcing manufacturing was such a catastrophic mistake, why don't politicians just bring the factories back? We see this rhetoric globally right now, for instance, with Donald Trump's tariff policies in the U.S. proposing a forced return to domestic manufacturing.
Right. Why not just pass a law and build a new steel plant in Sheffield tomorrow? Problem solved, right?
Exactly, why not?
The document is very clear on why this is mechanically nearly impossible in the short term. It comes down to three deeply entrenched hurdles: the skills gap, high overheads, and 4 decades of neglect.
You cannot simply flick a switch and suddenly compete with a nation like China, which has spent the last 40 years heavily investing in, subsidizing, and perfecting its physical manufacturing assets.
In the West, we lack the skilled vocational workforce to run modern factories. Our energy utility bills are vastly too high because, as we discussed, we privatized the grid, and we simply don't have the supply chain infrastructure.
In a global crisis, an economy built on consulting and banking is like bringing a spreadsheet to a knife fight.
That's a brutal way to put it, but mechanically accurate.
And the worst part is we paid for this transition into a service economy with debt, which brings us to the terrifying math the document outlines: the debt spiral.
Yes, the numbers here are sobering.
The UK is currently paying £111 billion a year just in interest payments on our national debt. Our total debt is at roughly 100% of our GDP.
It is an astronomical figure. It is the second largest budget item for the government, sitting right after healthcare. We are, as a nation, working for the bank.
When a country spends that much of its tax revenue just servicing past debt, there is zero money left for the future. There is no money for high-speed rail, no money for research and development, no money to subsidize the new green industries of tomorrow.
We are tapped out. We are maxed out on the credit card. And this isn't just a UK problem, which is what the research dives into next. The entire global board is shifting. We are entering the end of what the author calls the main character energy of the United States.
Yes, this is a profound geopolitical shift. We are witnessing the transition from a unipolar world where the U.S. was the sole, unquestioned superpower dictating the terms of global trade to a multipolar world.
And the absolute linchpin of that unipolar era was the U.S. dollar serving as the global reserve currency.
The reserve currency hack. We touched on the petrodollar earlier, but explain how this overarching hack worked, because the text calls the U.S. dollar the magic credit card.
Imagine having a credit card where the bank never, ever asks you to pay off the balance. Why? because everyone else in your neighborhood physically needs your specific credit card reward points just to buy their own groceries.
Because the world needed U.S. dollars to trade internationally, especially for oil.
Exactly. The U.S. could just print money to pay for its foreign wars, its massive budget deficits, and its endless imports without the currencies suffering crippling hyperinflation at home. The demand for the dollar was so high globally that the U.S. effectively exported its inflation to the rest of the world.
But the data notes that this hack is ending. At its peak, the dollar was used for over 80% of global trade. But as we approach 2026, its share has fallen to around 56 or 57%. De-dollarization is actually happening.
Nations are tired of the U.S. using the dollar as a geopolitical weapon. When the U.S. disagrees with a country, they can simply cut them out of the SWIFT banking system, effectively freezing their ability to trade.
So organizations like BRICS, plus Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now joined by the UAE and others, are actively building parallel financial systems. The document specifically mentions the development of blockchain payment systems.
And mechanically, why does blockchain matter here? Because a decentralized blockchain ledger allows these countries to settle trade instantly in their own local currencies.
Completely bypassing Western correspondent banks and the U.S. dollar entirely. It removes the U.S. from the middle of the transaction.
And the thesis presented in the text suggests this forces a massive retreat. The U.S. stops being the world police and becomes the neighborhood watch, focusing just on the Americas and its immediate interests.
But for the UK and Europe, that is a massive problem, because it means the NATO security umbrella we've been hiding under for 80 years is folding. If the U.S. pulls back, we're going to have to massively increase our own defense spending right in the middle of a crippling economic crisis.
Which perfectly highlights the extreme vulnerability of a service economy in a changing world. In a stable, unipolar world, where global shipping lanes are safe, banking, marketing, and consulting are highly profitable.
But in a fragmented multipolar world facing regional conflicts and supply chain shocks, physical assets are what actually matter. You can't eat a consulting report.
The research frames this as the upcoming resource war.
The examples provided here are genuinely terrifying. Take Morocco. The text points out that Morocco currently holds roughly 70% of the global reserves of phosphates.
And why is that critical? Because you need phosphates to make fertilizer.
Exactly. If you want to grow food on a mass scale, you need fertilizer. And if you need fertilizer, you need Morocco. Meanwhile, look at the UK's food security glitch. We import 40% of our food.
And the document notes a stark warning for 2026. British farmers are warning they might refuse to seed crops because the skyrocketing cost of energy and imported fertilizer makes farming a literal loss-making business.
Self-sufficiency is the ultimate power now, and we outsourced ours in the 1980s for cheaper retail prices.
So if we synthesize all of this, the staggering national debt, the severe lack of physical productive assets, the shift away from the dollar, and the concentration of wealth at the top, what is the forecast?
Yeah, what does the future look like?
The research lays out an endgame scenario for the Monopoly Board between 2026 and 2035 if the current trajectory holds.
And it is grim. It's the full realization of techno-feudalism. You are the forever renter. Everything you interact with is just a revocable license.
We are already seeing this with cars, where you have to pay a monthly subscription just to use the heated seats that are physically installed in the vehicle you bought.
Because the elite have opted out of the tax system via offshore havens, the structural collapse of the middle class isn't just a phase, it becomes permanent.
We arrive at what is termed a two-tier reality. Society splits strictly and cleanly between the asset owners who live entirely off passive income, dividends, and rent.
And the asset-less, who work endlessly just to pay the owners for the right to subsist.
And geographically, the UK splinters even further. Those former industrial towns face a resource trap. They have high utility costs from privatized energy, but absolutely no local economic engine to generate wealth to pay those bills.
And the central government can't swoop in to save them or build new infrastructure because the government is paralyzed by what the document calls shadow austerity.
Shadow austerity is a brilliant term. It means that even if a government claims they are spending more, the actual services on the ground are cut.
Why? Because every spare penny of tax money is purely servicing the interest on that £111 billion national debt or paying inflated contracts to private providers.
Okay, let's pause here.
So what does this all mean? We aren't just going to leave you staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. terrified of the future. The document does not end on despair. It provides a blueprint,
It offers a radical, actionable framework for breaking the wealth trap. The core message is that the feeling of being trapped isn't your personal failure, it is a feature of the operating system. And to beat it, you have to change how you play the game.
The fundamental solution proposed by MGR's research is the entrepreneurial rebellion. For decades, the standard advice was to study hard to get a job at the monopoly. Go work for the giant corporation.
The new imperative, if you want to escape the late game trap, is to stop trying to work for the giant and start aggressively competing with it.
Because true capitalism actually requires choice. If there's only one massive corporate provider for a good or service in your town, you aren't living in a free market. You are essentially living in a command economy controlled by a CEO instead of a dictator.
The text gives a great, highly visible example, Ceylon Cola versus Coca-Cola. It's not just about boycotting a massive brand you disagree with. It's about the mechanics of building a viable local alternative.
When you build alternative, you keep the wealth within your own community instead of funneling it up to an international corporate shareholder.
And participating in this rebellion requires a profound psychological shift regarding risk. The current system conditions you to be risk-averse. They want you terrified of losing your biweekly paycheck so that you stay compliant, keep your head down, and keep renting.
Breaking the trap requires taking the calculated risk to build and own something, no matter how small.
And to support this shift, the research introduces a fascinating structural solution by looking outside of Western economic orthodoxy. It looks at Islamic economic principles.
Yes, and this is a brilliant, entirely impartial analysis of how different economic frameworks try to solve the hoarding problem mathematically. The document points specifically to the concept of zakat.
Zakat is a mandatory 2.5% wealth tax in Islamic economics. But the critical mechanical distinction here is that it is a tax on hoarded wealth, not a tax on income.
Which completely reverses the Warren Buffett paradox. Instead of taxing the secretary's labor before she even sees the money, it taxes the billionaire's static, unmoving assets.
Exactly. Let's go back to our analogy of money as water in a pipe. If a billionaire hoards it offshore, the water stops flowing and the local crops die.
Mainstream economics tries to fix this by pouring more water in, printing money, which just causes inflation.
The Zakat system is designed as a built-in velocity of money mechanism. It acts like a pump. By heavily taxing wealth that is just sitting idle-like in an offshore bank account or an empty investment property, it makes hoarding mathematically painful.
It forces that money back into the real economy. The wealth is redistributed to those in need who immediately spend it on essentials, which stimulates demand for small businesses, creating jobs.
It takes the extractive funnel and literally bends it back into a circulating circle.
It forces the money to move. And politically, the analysis says we have to completely reclaim the idea of representation. We have to return to a logic where the small business owner, the person employing 10 people in their local town, taking real risks, dealing with local issues, is seen as the actual represented backbone of society, rather than the penthouse billionaire.
The ultimate vision laid out here is a new middle class based on a shared wealth model. It means pushing for a system where, instead of one massive corporate landlord owning 100 homes and extracting rent from 100 families, 100 families own their own homes and build their own equity.
We need to replace the red hotels on the monopoly board with community-owned greenhouses. So, synthesizing all of this massive amount of data, the final call to action from the document is basically 4 distinct steps for your generation.
Let's hear them.
1, stop being just a worker. Find a way to be an owner of an asset, no matter how small. 2, stop being just a consumer. Create choice and compete with the monopolies. 3, redistribute your success. Ensure wealth circulates in your local community instead of hoarding it. And 4, demand political representation that favors the small builder, not the massive extractor.
It is a profound paradigm shift. We've spent this deep dive unpacking an incredibly dense, eye-opening set of data, and the core takeaway is clear. Understanding the literal mechanics of the board is the prerequisite to changing the rules. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the power is still in the hands of the players if they choose to use it.
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over today. If this entire extractive system relies on us peacefully accepting subscriptions as the default way of life, well, what happens when an entire generation simply refuses the terms and conditions? What is one vital piece of your life that you are currently renting that you could actually start building a plan to own tomorrow? Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. Keep questioning the board.